Welcome back to the channel. I need to hurry and record this before my fat snoozy cat wakes up and realizes that the door is shut and he's trapped in here.
A few moments later.
If you've seen my part 1 of what I'm calling Trope Talk, even though that's not in the title, but I did talk about it in the video, this is part 2 to that little mini series that I'm doing. I did get off my schedule a little bit. As you probably can tell, I'm still recovering from the plague. So if you haven't seen part 1 or you need a little refresher, that part was really just a gripe and a rant that I have about a very specific trope that you see in fantasy and romantasy, being a lot of the same male main characters, the love interest, all looking the same or extremely similar with really hardly any varying degrees of personality, physical character traits, etc., etc. I'll link it in the description below. But because of that rant that I had, it got me thinking of a more general discussion of, okay, well, what if you have been working on a story or you started writing a story and then you look back and you realize, oh, I've accidentally written an overused trope. What do I do now? So that's what we'll be tackling today, and I'll be using my own early writing as an example of this, and which real vulnerable. I'm gonna get real vulnerable here, but it will be for a good cause. So before we dive into what to do, we really need to tackle what is a trope exactly. So the definition is interesting because it has changed over time, and I think this really has to do with like the booktubification, book talkification of this word of tropes has, in my opinion, kind of shifted over time. But if you Google it, trope means a figurative or a metaphorical use of a word or expression, or it is a significant or reoccurring theme. So, like a motif. But a lot of times, when we're talking about tropes or you hear people complaining about tropes, motif isn't what you like. That's not what comes to my mind when I think of tropes. A theme doesn't come to mind when talking about tropes. When I think about tropes, I think like, oh, a really dumb love triangle, like that sort of thing. But because I think that the more mainstream definition of tropes has changed over time, I think the word is more aligned with cliches, or what we think of cliches when it comes to storytelling. So really they are just like your typically worn out archetypes that some people are just tired of seeing, or you just see it over and over again, like your love triangles, the chosen one in like a hero's journey, or lost princess in usually like a fantasy or romantasy setting, etc., etc. Those are just a few basic examples. And I think because we kind of tie tropes and cliches together, I think tropes really kind of have a bad rap. I think they're seen as a really bad thing, and if you have any sort of trope in your story, then you're just a lazy writer. I wouldn't agree with that. I think tropes are not inherently bad. I think they are just a typically tried and true storytelling technique that has probably, in some regards, been a little overused, in the fact that, yeah, there are some that probably could use retirement or could use some reworking to make them more unique, but that doesn't make tropes in and of themselves a bad thing. Because the thing with tropes is, yes, I use the few examples that are really, really overused, but they also cover such a wide variety of storytelling devices that it is near impossible to tell a story without any sort of trope. And yeah, you could make the argument of, okay, well, you have your vague generic tropes, and then you have your overused tropes. Yeah, sure, but it's still the same thing. A trope is a trope is a trope. But I don't think it's helpful to make a blanket statement that tropes are bad in storytelling and you shouldn't include tropes in your book. Because, like I said, with there being such a wide variety, it's really easy to dog on the overused ones, like a love triangle. But there are also tropes that we don't think too much of that still technically fall under the umbrella of tropes. So think of like your your mentor trope as an example. So Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi, that sort of thing. Those are still tropes. Like having an older, wiser mentor in things like fantasy and sci-fi, you see that a lot. It's still a trope. That doesn't make it a bad thing. That just makes it a thing that we need to acknowledge. But I think more often than not, when you are in the throes of crafting a story, you will look back and there will be reoccurring things that you'll find in other books and other mediums. So at this point, you might be asking, okay, that's all well and good. I understand that there are different tiers to tropes. You have your generic vague ones, and then you have ones that are more overused and maybe more overused depending on what genre you're writing in. Now you're asking the question of, well, crap. I have accidentally written an overused trope. What do I do now? And let's say that you really did come about this trope on accident, because I do think that there are some writers where they will bring in overused tropes to market them. The ones that are really big on Book Talk, for example, and that is specifically how they market their book. So, enemies to lovers, only one bed, tall, dark, and handsome, that I did a whole ass video on complaining about, that sort of thing. That is more purposeful. So I think if you're coming at it with the approach of, oh, I really did not intend to include this trope, and now you're faced with the dilemma of, how do I change it? Do I keep it? Do I get rid of it? That's more what this video is about. If you want to purposely write a trope, by all means, that will be a video for a different day. But if we're really just focusing on, I did this on accident, how do I fix it? I've done the same thing. So a little backstory to this trope that I accidentally used, very much an overused trope. And bear with me because I promise I'm not trying to be hypocritical when I say this. But with my first book slash series that I decided like, oh, I think I want to write. This was way back in 2016, I want to say. Any hair members in the comments, if you're seeing this, maybe you can fact check me. But this was years ago, and this was my very first inkling of a story that I wanted to do. And so I really was in the I don't know what I'm doing type of territory. And because I was in college during that time, I really wasn't reading a whole lot, honestly, besides just reading a crap ton of French literature for my minor. I was not reading fantasy. So I wasn't really clued into what's really popular and popping off around that same time. So I honestly had no idea what ACOTAR even was. And you'll see how that trope comes into play. But then it was, I would say maybe like a year or two ago, I really kind of clued into, oh, this trope is getting a little. A lot of other people are doing this, and it made me do some self reflection on my own work in progress. And I have been doing basically an overhaul in a lot of regards, but specifically an overhaul for this character because I realized I had inadvertently created a shadow daddy trope. And I didn't even know it because I wasn't reading. And even at the time, like a year or two, that time frame really still wasn't reading romantasy or fantasy in that regard. And so I feel like it took me a while to realize, like, oh, I did that. Didn't mean to. And because I had spent so much time on the world building of this story, as well as building this character and fleshing him out more, I had not only created the Shadow Daddy trope, which he's had the entire time since 2016, but he also fell under the, uh, man of color trope that I just, again, had in my last rant video. And I had this moment of, wait a damn minute. And the funny thing is while he had technically fallen under the Shadow Daddy trope the entire time that he's been a character, I actually initially, in my mind, for the character, he had started off looking like Dylan O'Brien because I was vulnerable time. I hate talking about this. I was going through a phase, okay? And to me, I think Maze Runner had just come out, and I was like, that's doing it for me. And so, um, and so that happened. But he had evolved over time and no longer looked like a fantasy version of Dylan O'Brien. But I think as I grew the story over time with the world building, etc., started doing other works and books, and I felt my writing improve over time. He had changed. He had evolved. I'll just use his initials. We'll do KL for his initials. Here's a before, and over time he changed, and now he looks a little bit more like this after picture. So the interesting thing was, though, is even though I had kind of leaned into two different tropes, one was inadvertent, so the Shadow Daddy trope, and one was more purposeful in terms of making him a person of color. I think he's a good example of, okay, how did I get from point A to point B, and why did I make the decisions that I did? So let's talk about his physical description and why I made the changes that I did. Because on the surface, yeah, he falls under that male main character who isn't white, but is he racially ambiguous? I would say, without getting really spoilery, the answer is no. And this happened because once I had really fleshed out this world and the different cultures that I had included, and his backstory and his lineage, where he comes from, where his parents come from, it's two different places. So he's actually biracial, but both of his parents are actually not white as well. Those are all things that I didn't think of when I had first started his character. But I think it really is a good example of, yeah, once you really get into the weeds of your world building and what different cultures and diversity are in that world, and that is what I love about fantasy, is like you can just go so deep into it. I had come to the realization that I was like, he no longer is this initial character that I had. He had changed, and I had crafted him into the character that he was supposed to be, rather than just being this actor that I was like, I think this actor is really attractive, so I'm going to use him as my base model. I then was able to kind of carve and scrape and sculpt to where he became the character that he is, to where he now feels like his own person. He no longer feels like this blank slate of a conventionally attractive man that has vague descriptions. Now I can't think of this character as anyone besides who he is. And once I had kind of made the realization of, does he fall under that racially ambiguous POC character, because I really didn't want that, I had to kind of evaluate and determine, no, he doesn't. I made it a really specific point that he's not ambiguous in his ethnicity, and because of that, it adds to his character. And so much of his character is his cultural identity, is his racial identity. And it just really fleshed him out even more. And so, even though I felt like I kind of, technically speaking, like, yeah, leaned more into that trope, I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't revert him back to what he used to look like, because that's not him. That is a really flat character, in my opinion. And as for the other trope of him being a shadow daddy, yes, that was something that he had from the get-go. And once I had that realization of, oh, I didn't realize all the girlies were making shadow daddies in their fantasy and romantasy books, crap. That also was a moment of reflection of, okay, well, I don't want to be seen as just doing this overused trope. I don't want to have it be seen as lazy writing. And I had to evaluate that as well of, do I change it? Do I need to change who he is in terms of his abilities? But honestly, the more I sat with it, the more I didn't feel comfortable changing. Or I should say, I didn't feel comfortable stripping away his powers and instead focus more on what can I add to his powers or to his character or backstory that justifies why he has the powers that he does. Because I had really cemented that his powers, they are integral to the plot, and I couldn't change those. I couldn't change his abilities without having to rework large parts of the plot that I was like, this actually no longer works anymore if I change that. And I had to come to the decision of, I need to keep him the way he is, overused trope be damned, because that is who he is. That is very important to the plot. I didn't do it with the guise of, this is going to make him mysterious and sexy. I wasn't even thinking about that when looking at his abilities. It was really his abilities are very important to the plot, and I can't take that away from him. And so in terms of deciding to, rather than take away, what can I add, what can I flesh out more, I really dove deeper into the world building revolving around his abilities. He's not the only one that has these abilities, and again, not to get lost in all the details about certain things, but he has abilities that can be shared or given. It's more so given. It's technically considered a gift. You can be born with them. A certain type of people can be born with them, but he got his gifted to him, for lack of a better word. But these abilities at the same time, they are dying off. And I didn't want his shadow daddy abilities to be like so super rare. He's the only one that has them, that sort of thing. They're actually a subcategory of 3 different type of abilities that this race has, and they're all dying off slowly as time goes on, and so it does kind of, they're less common, but I didn't want him to be a special without any sort of reasoning behind it. And the other characters that possess the other 2 types of abilities, they are also very important to the plot. It really just came down to me realizing I cannot strip this ability away from KL just to shy away from using an overused trope or being seen as using an overused trope, because I wouldn't be stripping the different abilities away from my other characters. So it didn't seem fair to do it to him just because I had a moment of, oh crap, I didn't mean to do that. I think that's something that any writer has to grapple with if you find yourself in the same boat. You know, you really have to look into, do I keep this or do I kill this darling? Is there a way I can tweak this? Or does it really not serve any sort of purpose to the plot? And no one can make you get rid of these tropes. It really just kind of comes down to, what are you sacrificing if you get rid of it? And I like the approach more of, what can I add rather than what can I take away? Moral of the story is, you're free to use whatever tropes you want. They could be the generic ones that no one bats an eye at, or they could be your really overused ones that you see in so many romance books. And you can do that on purpose, and you can market your book like that. I personally think that that might be a little shallow and a bit of a cash grab, but hustle is hustle. No one can stop you from doing that. I've had to kind of get over being afraid of using tropes in my own work. And I think a more healthy approach that I've been able to take on is, how do I make this my own? Like I said, what can I add or tweak to add depth and flesh this thing out rather than just cutting it off cold turkey? And I asked the harem about their thoughts on this, and so I wanted to share just a few more words of wisdom from some of the harem members. I'll start with Jed. He had some good advice in a more general sense when it comes to tropes. Jed said, regarding tropes, I think it is important that they serve a purpose. Even if they don't end up subverting the trope, they should at least act as a foil to the protagonist. They just need to serve a purpose and be written on purpose. Thank you, Jed. Scott said, I feel like a big thing for me is how much thought the author has put into it. It's easy to tell when an author relies too much on the trope because they don't really flesh it out or do anything to make it better or subvert it in any way. When they take the time to think out how their trope actually plays out in their story and how it will change the story and how the story will change it, then I think you're on the right track. Thank you, Scott. I actually love that. And that's basically what this whole video has been about. And lastly, Nate said, I feel like what makes a trope overused is when the writer is relying on a reader to know that this trope exists. As in, the author is not doing the necessary legwork to set up the character/situation. Inverting or subverting a trope is not enough on its own. The trope, like anything else with writing, must be properly set up in order for it to have good payoff. And I will just say this last thing. I know that it can be kind of daunting to be working on a story and feel like, man, this isn't original enough. This isn't groundbreaking enough. Most stories are going to have reoccurring elements and themes in them. It's extremely hard to have a purely original idea, and that is okay. It is very human to write something that someone has already written. Really just kind of comes down to making it your own, really fleshing out your world and your characters, and that will give you a lot of grace. I'm going to end things here. I am planning on doing a part 3 to Trope Talk and most likely ending that mini-series with that last one, unless I've seen really great comments on my last video, so unless I see other things regarding tropes that I want to talk about, I'll talk about them. So I'm going to hesitantly say part 3 will be the last part, but no promises made. And if you were watching this video on the day it comes out, Lars and I will actually be doing a live stream today, this evening, talking more about tropes, so I'd love to see you there. And if you are not watching it the day it comes out and you're watching this in the future, that's really confusing, you can go back and watch past live streams, so you can go back and watch that past live stream where we talk about tropes. Bye, Mom!